So the Liberals have won the federal election and Mark Carney is officially here to stay. That's wild, especially considering where things stood back in December. By the numbers, the average Canadian had grown tired of the Liberal Party and specifically Justin Trudeau. There was a growing distrust in government, yet somehow Canadians voted for the banker, the company man, the lifelong corporate employee. It just goes to show, politics is anything but boring. How did the man who was supposed to lose, whose candidacy was seen as a soft reset for 2029? That's right, when Mark Carney first came back to Canada, all the analysts at the time would have told you he is fated to lose, he's destined to lose, and he has to focus on the bigger picture, build up the Liberal support base for 2029. Let's rewind to January 2025. The Liberals were in freefall. Chrystia Freeland had resigned as the finance minister, prompting Justin Trudeau to step down as party leader and prorogue parliament. The party's approval ratings were abysmal. Conservatives, on the other hand, energized by years of frustration, demanded a snap election. Pierre Poilievre led this charge. Trudeau's decision to prorogue parliament instead of calling an election only poured gasoline on the fire. He had already become the lightning rod for everything from inflation to unaffordable housing to declining trust in government. Whether fairly or not, I've got videos on that, links below. Trudeau had been painted as the face of Canada's feelings, and on the other hand, Pierre Poilievre had spent years building his brand as being anti-Trudeau.
When will we put an end to this wacko policy by this wacko Prime Minister? No. Then you have his friend, the Maserati Marxist over there.
Poilievre was relentless, opposing liberal legislation, landing viral hits like the Maserati Marxist, the Wacko PM, and even getting expelled from parliament in the process. His rhetoric was punchy, viral, and tailor-made for the social media age. It worked. Young, typically disengaged voters were now paying attention. Conservatives surged in the polls, riding a global conservative wave that had emphasized anti-establishment, tough talking, and basically a Trump-style populism, right? But this is where things began to unravel. See, when Trump won the US election in early 2025, suddenly Canadians were spooked. The bluster, the threats, the rhetoric about annexing Canada, all of those things stopped being a joke. Personally, I would say things hit critical mass when Trump's Vice President J.D. Vance quipped on the morning of February 20th, the day of the Four Nations hockey final.
And to Canada, if you guys don't win, the tariffs are even higher. No, I'm kidding. That's the president's decision.
Canada rallied behind one thing that day, bringing down the big brother. The slogan, "Elbows Up," became a unifying cry. That night, even Quebecers were belting out the English anthem, and when Connor McDavid scored the game-winning goal in overtime to defeat America, the country exploded in patriotic pride. Then, in his final act as Prime Minister, as his final parting gift to his party, Justin Trudeau tweeted, "You can't take our country and you can't take our game." That tweet landed. In a moment when Canadians were scared, uncertain, and feeling insulted by our neighbor to the south, emotions flipped. Old grievances were briefly forgotten. Many Canadians who had considered voting blue suddenly remembered the leader they had once admired in 2015. Everything was forgiven and people loved Trudeau again. And thus came the red wave. Polls flipped overnight. Liberal fortunes surged, especially as Carney entered the race for leadership. More importantly, Carney embraced this new Canadian moment. He adopted elbows up message from day one. Poilievre and his party, even though they had pushed themselves as being for the little guy, being the pro-Canada party, surprisingly managed to miss this patriotic wave. See, for years prior to this moment, Canadians had been unsure of their identity. What is a Canadian? Are immigrants Canadians? Is someone who doesn't speak English fluently a Canadian? Someone who plays hockey? But hockey is a declining sport in Canada. But that night, the noise faded and patriotism roared. To push back against Trump became synonymous with loving Canada. On that night, if you loved Canada, you were Canadian. This was a historic night for the Canadian identity. This was devastating for Poilievre. His core message was Canada is broken. His campaign was built on exposing flaws of Canada, not celebrating the Canadian identity. And Canadians, rightly or wrongly, I'm not saying it was right or wrong, but the point is, Canadians in this moment did not want more division. They wanted hope. They wanted unity. And in this, Carney delivered, and he delivered strongly. Carney pushed back against Trump's threats, declaring Canada would never become the 51st state. Carney continued to repeat those words. Canada would never become the 51st state, and he never shied away from that. Furthermore, he promised new alliances in Europe, and after becoming PM, he followed through, skipping Washington altogether, choosing to visit the King and meeting French leaders, and negotiating deals with the EU, and Australia that had originally been intended for America. Canadians wanted little Canadian victories, and swooping in for deals that America had lined up and taking it before they could. Canadians loved it. This was a huge win for the Canadian identity, which had now become a key instrument for this election. Trump would then go on to slap tariffs on Canadian exports and falsely blamed Canada for America's drug epidemic. Liberals quickly countered with data. Most drugs came from Mexico. Many illegal guns come from America into Canada. Canadians wanted someone to defend the nation, and Carney would. Poilievre had a very polar opposite reaction. Poilievre vowed to crack down on Canadian fentanyl kingpins. The timing felt tone deaf. Canadians did not want internal finger pointing. They wanted a leader who would stand up for them. They wanted a leader who said, no, the drugs don't come from Canada. Poilievre instead doubled down on that Canada needs to do better. For right or wrong, Canadians just did not want this in this moment. And Poilievre could not really do that because he had spent years saying Canada was stupid. His words, not mine. Carney countered with, we can give ourselves more than America could ever take away from us. You cannot come up with a more patriotic slogan than that. But not only words, he would actually push for interprovincial unity, resurrected talks on pipelines, and wore his patriotism openly. And he wore it proud. And remember, Carney is not just the Canadian patriotism cheerleader. He is a banker. He's a recipient of Order of Canada. He helped steer the economy during the Great Recession. The Canadians found solace in that. Canadians were scared of the economic downturn. Well, here comes the finance guru who happens to love Canada. It really was the perfect storm for a guy like Carney. So yes, even though Canadians still have a growing distrust in government, they voted for the bureaucrat. I mean, he's not exactly a bureaucrat, but kind of sort of, he fits the mold. The company man, the expert. In a time when people don't trust the experts, it's very fascinating what happened. And it really does feel like a movie. I might make a whole video on the hockey game and how that really did change the course of these elections. Congrats to Mark Carney though. I'm genuinely excited to see what he can do. Despite what a lot of people think, I believe he is inheriting a recovering Canada, not a broken one. We all love to point fingers at Trudeau, but the truth is the pandemic was a massive shock to global supply chains and labor market. You cannot talk about the inflation without addressing that. You have to. In good conscience, you have to. I'm not saying the Liberals handled it perfectly either. Even Trudeau, before stepping down, admitted that they mishandled immigration. The new Liberal stance is now to pause and slow down immigration while focusing on better integration strategies. Meanwhile, inflation has been coming down, unemployment has been recovering. These are all signs of a recovering economy. I'm not saying Carney is inheriting a strong economy and a strong Canada. I would actually say I would say he's inheriting somewhat of a very divisive and fragile country, but not one that is on utter collapse, regardless of what some political pundits might try to paint. I'm also really intrigued to see how Pierre Poilievre adjusts his approach, if at all, of course. In some ways, he was very successful, incredibly successful. The Conservatives gained more vote shares than ever before. And it's clear that Canada as a whole has shifted more to the right. The NDP lost a significant chunk of their support, and many of those seats went to the Conservatives. And speaking of the NDP, I'm very curious about their future under a new leadership. I think most Canadians Canadians, if not all Canadians, would agree that we do not want to become a two-party country. Nobody wants that, I don't think. The NDP and Green Party play a vital role in keeping our democracy vibrant. Their opinions matter. Opinions of all Canadians matter, and the two-party system just does not do that justice. So I hope to see a resurgence for the NDP in years ahead. I thought he seemed surprisingly human during his address to the Conservative Party. If he can lead with that version of himself, the one focused on what his party can offer Canadians rather than just attacking the Liberals, I think he could actually win, and I would actually have him as a favorite to win the next election. Clearly, Canadians resonate with his message of standing up for the little guy. Honestly, I'd be surprised if this Liberal administration lasts a full term, not because Carney lacks capability, but because this election felt more like Canadians rejecting Conservatives rather than Canadians embracing Liberals or forgiving Liberals.